So thank you everyone for joining this webinar tonight. First of its kind CCAN webinar on the organization PJM. We're gonna get started in just a minute, but if you want, you can put your name and where you're calling in from in the chat. And then we'll get started with our expert panel in just a few short moments. Okay, well, thank you everyone. My name is Jake Schwartz. I am on the Federal Affairs team here at Chesapeake Climate Action Network, or CCAN. We really appreciate everyone taking some time out of their Thursday evening to be with us to talk about this perhaps wonky, but really, really important and not often talked about enough subject, PJM interconnection. So if you're just joining now, please feel free to put your names and pronouns, or names and where you're calling in from in the chat. Someone's saying the chat is disabled. Okay. Well, then never mind. But we'll have Q&A portion later in the evening where we'll be able to ask questions directly to the panelists. So again, we're here tonight to talk about PJM interconnection, which stands for Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland. I know, crazy acronym. Those are the original states in the region. So most of you have probably never heard of this organization before, but it's the group that manages our electricity grid, which makes sense. They operate fully behind the scenes. They're not out in the spotlight. They're not talked about by politicians every day, but they might be one of the most important organizations on both clean energy and on how much we pay for electricity that you've never heard of. So there are hundreds of folks joining this call tonight that come from all 13 states in the region. So despite only having 3 states in its name, there are little bits, at least, of 13 states that are in the PJM region. It goes all the way from New Jersey to a little portion of Illinois, and as far south as a little bit of North Carolina. So we're all here to learn about what PJM is, why they are prioritizing fossil fuels over more affordable, clean energy, and what connection they have to our rising energy bills. Because I'm sure I'm not the only one here whose bill's been pretty consistently rising over the last couple of years. And there's a pretty direct connection that PJM has to that. So we're going to start our panel in just a minute, and that should last around 20 minutes. Then we'll have 10 or so minutes for questions from the audience, and we'll close out by going over next steps, which, spoiler, is CCAN's first action meeting on PJM, which is scheduled next month on November 18th at 6 p.m. And so we'll touch on that at the end, but in case you have to run before the end of this call, I'm going to put the link to that action meeting in the chat. That'll be a virtual hour-long meeting next month where we will collectively, as activists and volunteers, take action by writing letters to the editor and calling on our governors to do more. As we'll discuss tonight on our panel, governors are one of the kind of few elected officials that we have that have the microphone and the ability to speak out and demand that PJM does more to prioritize clean energy and lower our electricity bills. So I'm going to put that link in the chat right now so folks can sign up as we start on this panel. And as an FYI to everyone on this webinar, it is recorded, and we will be sending out a recording tomorrow. And then also, if you would like closed captioning, you can find that under the More section on the bottom of your Zoom panel. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists this evening. We have Claire Lang-Ree from the Natural Resource Defense Council. Claire focuses on regional transmission build-out and market mechanisms to make sure clean energy is treated fairly. Prior to this role, Claire worked on state climate policy in the American West as an NRDC fellow. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in Earth System Science from Stanford. John Gordon from Advanced Energy United. His work is on increasing wholesale electricity market access. John has over 30 years of leadership experience in electric power and energy markets, And prior to Advanced Energy United, John served as an appointee of the governor of New York as senior advisor to the president of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Finally, we have Emily Scarr. Emily is a longtime consumer and environmental advocate who leads Maryland PIRG's energy and utility work to ensure Marylanders have access to clean, affordable, and efficient energy. Since joining Maryland PIRG in 2013, she has led and worked in coalitions to strengthen democracy in Maryland, improve public health, reduce exposure to toxic chemicals, and improve access to that clean energy. So without further ado, we're going to start with the panel section of tonight's webinar. Claire, we're going to begin with you. So can you start at the beginning for those of whom are on this call and are completely new to this issue? What exactly is PJM and how is it structured?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. And thanks for having us tonight. It's really exciting to be on this panel. It's a good question. PJM is really mysterious, I think, to the average person. The basics is that PJM is a regional transmission organization, or RTO, which is essentially a grid operator. And as Jake mentioned, PJM's territory covers 13 states and DC and includes Maryland. Actually, Maryland was one of the founding members of PJM and is the M in PJM. So around 100 years ago, actually almost exactly 100 years ago, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, utilities in Pennsylvania and New Jersey agreed to pool their power. And 50 years later, two Maryland utilities joined and it became Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland Interconnection, or PJM. Think of PJM like an air traffic controller. So they're in charge of maintaining reliability for the region, which is industry jargon for keeping the lights on. They primarily do this through managing day-to-day operations of the bulk power grid, which includes transmission lines, large power plants, and large substations. The way they do this is a couple mechanisms. So they do a lot of forecasting of the future supply and demand conditions for the region. They do transmission planning, and they also administer electricity markets, which send price signals to power plant operators. And the main goal of those electricity markets is to ensure that, enough supply is being signaled to match demand in the region. So PJM is a nonprofit and has over 1,000 employees. And to be really clear, PJM itself doesn't have a profit motive. So unlike the utilities, which are members of PJM, the actual organization PJM doesn't, make any money off of these electricity markets. Also, everything PJM does, like other RTOs, is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. It's kind of an obscure federal agency that has been regulating the federal power grid for a very long time. So PJM, like any other LLC, has a CEO, an independent board of directors, and a bunch of senior staff, as I mentioned. They also have subject matter staff who work with stakeholders, including members and including environmental organizations, through this very convoluted stakeholder process that consists of high-level committees, subcommittees, task forces, senior task forces, etc. They make decisions sort of like Congress, except that the members of PJM who have voting power aren't elected. So as I mentioned earlier, these members include transmission owners, generation owners, utilities, energy suppliers, large customers, so large users of electricity, and consumer advocates. And there's also many of us who aren't formal members of PJM, but we still participate in PJM and we advocate at PJM to make sure they're, treating clean energy fairly and protecting consumers from high costs. I'll also just note, and I think this will be a theme throughout today's talk, is that state governors' offices don't have a formal role within PJM, even though state residents pay for the energy bills that are funneled through PJM's markets. States are also jurisdictionally in charge of power generation. I think I'll stop there and see if there's any follow-up questions.
Sounds good. Cool. Yeah, we're definitely going to keep talking about the role of governors tonight. That's a really key stakeholder in this process, in an office that is, there to advocate for its citizens and ratepayers, which is us. Emily, for the last couple of capacity auctions, rates have continued to go up for states across the PJM region. Why is this, and what direct role does PJM have on ratepayers? Emily, I don't know if your connection is working. If you can, yeah.
Back. It's cutting in and out. So maybe after I address this question, I'll try to switch to my cell phone Wi-Fi. So if I'm guessing correctly, based on the notes you sent, you were asking about how exactly bills have gone up.
Yes.
And the auction results always happen a year in advance when we see them on our bills. PJM customers this year are paying an additional $12.5 billion for electricity, and next year it's going to be even worse. It obviously varies throughout the region. Maryland has been one of the hardest hit. Some Maryland customers are seeing up to a 25% increase in electrical bills this year. It's spread out seasonally, but that's a pretty big hit in one year. The biggest factor driving up the rates has been PJM's failure to connect clean energy to the grid. Perhaps oversimplifying, but we only have 25 minutes. PJM has been so slow to enable new energy to connect that it's created a bottleneck on what they call their queue. They even shut it down for a while, not allowing any new applications. And notably, over 90% of the projects waiting to connect to the grid are renewable energy sources like solar power, energy storage. And if PJM connected all of that clean energy, that would be enough electricity to power 60 million homes for a year. So the failure in the rate increases has created a perception of a supply increase, right? If they're supposed to be controlling this balance of supply and demand, prices go up when there's not enough supply. But it's a little bit of a false perception because they're the ones who are actually controlling the supply access. And it's not like there aren't energy generators trying to interconnect to bring that energy to us. But if we don't get it together, they are beginning to let things onto the grid, still with some wacky rules that favor fossil fuel generation. There could be a real supply crisis, right? There's also a lot of question about the growth of data centers and its impact on demand. Is it real? Is it being inflated to some degree? Regardless, PJM certainly needs to get more energy connected to bring costs down. And I'd be remiss not to add that there are other bad decisions at PJM that are hurting ratepayers beyond the queues that are, artificially raising prices, I would say, especially for Maryland customers, although I imagine there are lots of great examples in other parts of the region too. And I think we can get into that a little bit more later in the discussion.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, we're going to discuss that later. But I think the main takeaway there is the idea of this queue, is of a line that energy projects have to wait in to get connected to the grid. And most of that line now is clean energy projects that are being delayed and could be approved and could start construction, but are not. And as a response, we not only have less clean energy, but less sources of energy, which can drive up price.
Yeah, and Evergreen Action recently did a analysis on this and what types of queue reform could mean for ratepayers. I can paste a link to that in the chat. But they found that if they actually enabled these reforms to their queue process, it would bring costs down for customers by about $500 a year. So we're talking about real savings because of this, because of queue reform.
Yeah, $500 a year is nuts. Okay, John, turning to you, you've been working on these issues for years. How has PJM changed, and what are some recent changes that they're going through as an organization?
Well, I think the real story with PJM I'm going to start with is really a failure to change. PJM has sort of been doing the same thing the same way in spite of massive changes in our industry. And the problems in that interconnection queue that Emily talked about were really a result of PJM not anticipating the clean energy transition that we all saw coming. And the big change for PJM in their interconnection queue, they used to, before clean energy, say 20 years ago, PJM would get a couple of interconnection requests a year for a large power plant. There would just be a few of them. And it took them years to do these studies, but everything moved slowly. It was just a couple of interconnection requests. But then with the clean energy transition, they started getting hundreds and hundreds of requests for smaller solar sites and distributed energy. And as I said, we all knew that this was the transition. We were going to move from these large central, fossil burning power plants to clean distributed energy. And PJM just didn't anticipate this change, and that's how they got so far behind. The interconnection queue just got completely clogged with all of these clean energy projects, and that's why they failed to get onto the grid in a timely fashion. And the time they spent waiting in that queue, in some cases 4 or 5 years waiting. I mean, economic conditions changed, so much changed. A lot of those projects were no longer, viable often by the time they finally got through the interconnection queue. So that's been a big problem for PJM, to be innovative, to be anticipatory, to prepare for and see what was changing, and respond to state clean energy policies in a timely fashion. And I think part of that is their governance structure that Claire and Emily alluded to. This member voting structure, which also hasn't changed, and it really reflects a legacy sort of ownership of utilities, transmission owners, really incumbents that have a vested interest in the status quo. And so the votes and that ultimately lead to policy decisions at PJM were sort of skewed toward traditional fossil resources rather than the clean energy resources. So, one of the things we've been pushing PJM to do is to change, and to change rapidly. And the other big change right now for PJM is all of this state engagement. Suddenly, because of all of these problems, the governors and the states are paying attention. And for the first time, PJM, rather than operating in relative anonymity, is in the spotlight and getting a lot of political heat. So that's a big change for PJM, and they're going to have to deal with that.
Absolutely. That's something we've heard from our members just in the last couple of months, is they're reaching out saying, like, hey, we're hearing about this. Like, what does this mean for us, for our monthly electricity bills? In the last, I think, 2-3 months, it's been in the New York Times for the first time. Our governors across the region have spoken out in public statements about it. It's finally gaining traction in the national media and in the conversation around energy. And yeah, about time, because there's a lot of change that they have to do to meet this moment. So Claire, speaking of kind of big issues of the moment, data centers and the increased demand for electricity that is far outpacing any increased supply in the region. I know PJM is looking at this issue and trying to figure out what role they can play or not play in handling this new influx. So what can they do to not screw over consumers in this moment?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. And it's pretty difficult to overstate how big of a deal this is right now in PJM. This might be one of the most consequential decisions that PJM makes from a cost perspective this decade. Just to outline the problem, projected data center demand in PJM is projected to be as large as a small country by 2030. This is like one of the biggest challenges that PJM is facing, and it's far outpacing other regions in the US right now, just because of, Data Center Alley being located within PJM. And as Jake mentioned, the real issue with this is that demand is now outpacing energy supply. That's the main reason that electricity prices have skyrocketed in the last 2 auctions, which, everyday ratepayers will feel through 2025, 2026, 2027, and beyond. So, this $20 bill increase that we saw through the last auction, NRDC is expecting this to rise to as much as $70 per month over the next 6 years unless PJM takes action to protect consumers from these basically cost socialization of these large data centers. To its credit, PJM recognizes that this is a reliability issue. Having new demand that surges beyond supply is an issue for risk of blackouts and risk of really expensive scarcity periods that will affect everyone. But PJM is falling short and really not doing as much as it should to protect affordability or reliability. As we've talked about before, we think this is because the data center companies and large power plants have a lot to gain from the status quo and are very influential in PJM. These large power plant companies will be paid many millions of dollars, billions of dollars per year if things stay the way they are. So they're not interested in change, to John's earlier point. The good news is that there is a way forward. The best thing PJM could do is to require new data centers to bring and pay for their own new capacity, and for this capacity to be clean. So this will result in certainty, speed to market, and reliability for data centers, and also protect everyday ratepayers from paying for the energy costs that these data centers are causing on the grid. And this could include demand response programs or new battery storage or things like that. The issue is that this is moving really quickly at PJM. So, PJM is trying to finalize rules around what they're going to do about data center load growth as soon as October 24th. The board is going to decide on a solution by November 19th. So I actually think, I would urge, you all to stay engaged on this issue. And I think like reaching out to Governor Moore and urging him to be engaged on this issue and protect consumers from these costs would be an extremely effective thing to do in the near term. I'm also pasting in the chat a blog that NRDC put out that explains this issue in a little more detail. But yeah, I would just urge us to all stay engaged on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's literally never been a more important time to be engaged on PJM issues. PJM and FERC, the body that regulates RTOs like PJM, are deciding this like right now. Like this year, a lot of these issues are being decided, issues that will define what rates look like for the next 10 years. I mean, this is like really important stuff. And so thank you again to everyone on this call. You couldn't have joined at a better time. And this fall is really the time to take action and to start making this a conversation in our political discourse around clean energy. And that starts with as simple as educating your neighbor and talking to folks in your community about what this thing called PJM is and what we can do, we including our governors, to help ask for change. So, Emily, politically, where does this fossil fuel bias that is really deep within PJM seem to come from? I mean, do other RTOs have this same problem?
Well, Claire touched on this a little bit already, but basically it's the foxes guarding the henhouse, right? The stakeholders at PJM are wide and vast, but it's primarily dominated by energy generators and utilities. And it's the legacy energy generators. PJM in particular has much more fossil fuel power than other RTOs around the country. Claire or John could give me the precise numbers, but I think it's like 43% gas, 27% coal, and then 6% is the solar, wind, hydropower combined. And so, of course, those business models, they do have a profit incentive to favor fossil fuels in their own energy production. And the votes of consumer advocates are just like one in a bucket of all these corporations. And then the utilities, it's not like as direct. Utilities make a lot of money on a wind plant if they're doing the transmission or a power plant, but they do make more money on new transmission, upgrading transmission to power plants as opposed to distributed energy like solar power, which if someone's putting it on their home, they're not making any transmission investments for that. So they have not exactly been helpful, and there are other ways that they have profited due to PJM's decision making. And you can see this manifest in a variety of ways. Rules that tend to favor fossil fuels, even if they don't say so explicitly. So right now they're saying their new Q reform is fuel neutral, and yet the sort of requirements and definitions of large load that can fast track and skip the line is just going to be oil. It's just going to be gas plants, basically. And then there's also just like a failure to plan, right? Failure to do long-term grid planning and this transition that John was talking about as far as the need to bring on clean energy and also the inevitable retirement of aging power plants. So for example, Maryland customers are having to pay overtime for old power plants that want to retire because PJM hadn't properly planned for their retirement. We're also having to pay a premium because they gave a no-bid contract to BG&E to upgrade the transmission line to replace it. So we're sort of getting screwed on both ends, all while they missed a great opportunity to invest in battery storage on the site of the power plant, which would have been a faster and cheaper way to replace those peaker plants. And John's team at Advanced Energy United has found that PJM has some of the longest wait times in the country for interconnection, and that PJM has also sort of refused to comply with FERC direction to reform its practices. So, well, I think a lot of us are often disappointed in FERC's using their regulatory authority, even when they are sort of telling PJM to do better. So yeah, we're pretty bad. And I think we certainly have less clean energy than other RTOs around the country. And that's impacting, all of these decision makers, both our expertise, but also the motivation behind their decisions.
Yeah. I mean, that's literally the definition of foxes guarding the henhouse if they're helping influence it from the inside. So, Blair, what role do governors have? Specifically, Governor Moore, as many folks on this call are from Maryland. What can they be doing right now to fight for more clean energy? And maybe in that answer, if you could touch on the reliability must run rule and what that means.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll also invite the other panelists to jump in here too. I'm sure they all have great ideas. But I'll just say, yeah, I think governors have a really important growing voice right now in PJM. We saw, I don't know, some of our other colleagues have described the governors of PJM as sleeping giants, and now the giants have been awoken by these high energy prices. So governors, I think, are leaning into their voice in PJM. They're taking more direct action with PJM senior leadership and the board. We saw an example of this where Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania negotiated with PJM through a lawsuit to actually institute a cap on their energy markets, their capacity markets, which prevented prices from going maybe as high as they would have in the last auction. So we could see that kind of action from governors going forward. The governors have also taken sort of a historic, you know, agreement to form a formal collaborative, and they're looking for avenues to play a more formal role in PJM going forward. I think to go back to my earlier point, I think to me, the biggest issue right now is just dealing with data centers and protecting the general public from these runaway costs and reliability issues that come with that. I think if governors act together on that issue, they'll have a very strong voice. And I think Governor Moore could definitely play a very big role in urging PJM to do more to protect its consumers from these costs. I also think that as a state that has really ambitious clean energy policies, Governor Moore, can stand up for clean energy in his own state. So I think like ensuring that data centers bring their own clean energy, that's something that PJM can't require, but the states could. I also think looking for ways to support technologies like battery storage that, we've seen very low rates of battery storage in PJM. It's partially because of the long queues that we've already referenced, but it's also because battery storage might need more support from the state side or other incentives. So that would be another really amazing avenue for the state. And one last way I'll mention is that, as many of you know, I think Trump has rolled back these federal tax credits, which were very important for clean energy resources. Luckily, they haven't expired yet, and there's a limited window where we think state support for clean energy resources to get constructed and complete construction will allow them to access those tax credits before they expire. So that's another avenue that we think governors could go down to support those sort of late stage projects as they come out of PJM's queue and make sure they get across the finish line. I also think you touched on the RMR issue. So this is something Emily already mentioned, but RMR stands for Reliability Must Run Agreement. And it's a limited circumstance where if a big power plant wants to retire, and PJM finds that if that power plant were to retire, there would be big transmission issues, reliability issues caused by that retirement, it's actually forced to stay online. And the most recent example of this that we saw was this huge coal plant called Brandon Shores in Maryland, which was forced to remain online even though most people knew it was going to retire far ahead of time. And PJM was very remiss to do any sort of proactive planning to make sure that retirement went smoothly, to replace it with any clean energy or battery storage, and really to do anything to protect consumers from this super high price that we're paying to basically keep coal online. So this is something that NRDC and other organizations are actively working on right now in PJM, is making sure PJM develops a process to evaluate alternatives to RMRs and plan for retirements before they happen, so we don't have to keep fossil plants online past their expiration date.
I would just add to that, the thing that sort of adds insult to injury for the RMR is Maryland ratepayers are already paying this overtime cost to keep the plant online, but then PJM decided to not even include that energy in their auction last year, even though, again, to signal that we need more energy, even though the new energy plan had already been rolled out for a new transmission line, which they gave to BG&E. Again, no bid contract. They bid in at $800 million. It's already up to $1.5 billion. So now we're paying for that double cost too. By leaving that out of the auction last year, that's costing BG&E area Pepco customers $5 billion this year, which accounts for 65% of our projected rate increase. And that's just windfall profits for these polluting fossil fuel plants, right? They sort of have like a golden ticket. Oh, we just tell them to retire, then we get more money. and for no reason. And it's so outrageous. There was a complaint put in from our Office of the People's Counsel. They've reversed their decision. So in this year's auction, miraculously, it's not included, which is good. BG&E customers are going to get some of that money back. But it just sort of just shows how arbitrary some of these decision-making processes are, that they didn't undo that decision. We're still out that $5 billion.
Yeah. I mean, to put a even finer point on that for everyone here, a coal plant stayed online past its retirement date, and we, the ratepayers, are paying more for it, right? It's not saving anyone money, it's costing more money, and we're keeping coal online. I mean, talk about illogical, inefficient, uneconomical. John, wonder if you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, we covered a lot of ground there, but just to make it perfectly clear, I mean, these RMR contracts are the result of this failure to plan. I mean, this is an absolute last resort emergency tool that PJM uses. But, you know, if you had done your planning properly, we would have new clean generation to replace these retiring fossil units. And if it isn't perfectly clear already, there is no more expensive way for consumers to provide supply than these RMR contracts. And PJM's supply situation is so dire now, I think it's pretty clear that no plants are going to be allowed to retire. And there's some concerns that these plants could start gaming this system and announce their retirement so they can get one of these sweetheart RMR contracts with PJM to continue running at this incredibly high cost to consumers and the environment, I might add. You know, these RMR contracts they've been around for a long time. They're nothing new. It was always this last resort emergency condition. But it's really unfortunate that this is something PJM is actually relying on right now to keep the lights on.
Yeah, unfortunate to say the least. Well, thank you all. I think that's going to conclude our official panel portion, but now we're going to take questions from the audience, and I'll let whoever wants to answer them. I'm seeing one, and you can use the Q&A function to ask those questions. So I'm seeing one from Lisa. How can we, as ratepayers, have an impact on change? And how will the administration's anti-renewable energy policy impact PJM and rates? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I'll take the second part. I mean, what the action that's been taken on offshore wind, you know, could not be more devastating to PJM. I mean, that is a massive source of supply that, you know, we were absolutely counting on to carry us into the future as part of this clean energy transition. And so we're at a time where we need every last bit of generation we can possibly have to take that massive source of clean generation off the table is, you know, beyond devastating and makes absolutely no sense.
And I would just add, I think the most important thing is actually to educate your family, community members, friends about the reasons behind the rate increase. So I know it's a little different state by state. Sorry if you can hear my children screaming. They found me. But there's a lot of misinformation and false information blaming clean energy for these rate increases and, you know, saying we need new fossil, you know, new oil, coal plants, new gas plants. And so I think actually telling that story and countering that information is really important. You can also call on your state and state elected officials, and governor to stand up to PJM. And finally, I would say, you know, as much as I care about this, utility delivery rates are also an issue, and the states have more control over that. So if you're particularly someone who's passionate about utility rates and how much it costs to heat and cool homes, it's worth looking at that because there is something that your state actually has more direct authority on.
Yeah, thank you. Another really good question from Lauren talking about the queue, which is like one of the most important things in this conversation around PJM. So she asks, why are renewable energy projects stuck in the queue? How does the project approval process work?
Well, I'll take a crack at that. Again, part of it is the whole interconnection queue process, it sort of studies any project that wants to connect to the electric grid. PJM has to do an analysis, see how it'll impact the grid, and see if any upgrades are required to make sure that, the wires they're connecting to are capable of carrying the load and so forth. So they do these interconnection studies that are really complex engineering studies, and they take PJM 3 years to do these studies. And as I mentioned earlier, when this massive influx of clean energy projects came into the interconnection queue, suddenly they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interconnection queue studies, that each one of them that can take up to 3 years. And PJM was doing them in this sort of sequential first come, first serve manner that they had always done them, back when they just had a couple of requests a year. And this is, again, the failure to change, failure to anticipate. The backlog got so huge, they literally shut the queue down. So, since 2022, if you're a project that wants to connect to the grid in PJM, you have been unable to even request an interconnection study. So the queue has been completely shut down since 2022 for new energy resources. So it's no wonder that the clean energy resources aren't here on the grid to replace these retiring fossil units, as we all would have hoped, because we're hopelessly stuck in this queue. And they've been in there for so long, and the whole so many economic conditions have changed in the time they've been waiting for these interconnection studies. There is concern about the viability of these projects, given all the supply chain problems we're seeing today. Inflation, the cost of everything has doubled in some cases since these projects were conceived. It's really a devastating problem to not have a functioning interconnection queue when you desperately need new generation to bring costs down.
Yeah, and that is so important right now. We need more energy, not less, right? We can't be wasting time with years and years projects in the queue. So a question from Lee: why is Governor Moore supporting new gas plants? Why not support distributed energy and storage instead? Emily, want to take a...
Yeah, I don't, unless I missed something, Governor Moore hasn't been supporting new gas plants, right? He actually pushed back on, didn't support the legislation last year that would have fast-tracked gas plant siting. I could be critical of Moore for not doing something as I want him to do, but on this, so far he's been pretty good. We have seen some interest from Democratic leadership and legislators to bring new gas plants into the mix on Maryland, but the governor's been okay on this, is from my experience. Again, tell us I'm missing something. Jake, your team at ECAN has actually been the ones doing more on this than Maryland PERG, so maybe you have something to add.
No, I think that's right, and I think the second part of the question is the prioritization of energy and storage is so important right now, right? Like solar and wind are no longer enough. We need storage to be part of that conversation. So I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'm seeing one from Larry. He says, how can we best induce those building data centers to bring your own new clean energy, which is a fun new acronym, bring your own new clean energy, or Beyonce. How can you get state legislation or state regulatory agencies to work on that?
I can take a stab at this. I think you got it exactly right. It's kind of all three. I think I'll start with from the PJM side. What PJM can and must do is make sure that these data centers aren't poaching existing energy from the grid that's already needed. As we can see, like the supply demand mix is already really tight, and we don't want these data centers taking existing power off of the grid. I think so. PJM, as we mentioned earlier, won't be in a position where they can prioritize clean energy resources over other resources to supply data centers. But they can protect consumers by making sure data centers are required to pay for their own new capacity, which I think in our ideal world means grid connected capacity or distributed resources or demand response. So it's actually benefiting the entire region instead of just that data center. But we think like the real avenue for getting the Beyonce instead of just the BYOC is through the state avenue. So state legislatures could do a lot of work here. We also think state regulatory agencies a lot of states are taking really proactive states, making new rules to require data centers to pay special rates, developing data center tariffs, and really acting to protect consumers. They could also think about clean energy in those procedures. One thing we have going for us is both the pure economics and the speed of clean energy. So, a new gas plant takes years to construct, and a new battery storage plant, which has a really similar capacity value to a gas plant, can take a matter of months. So, for these data centers who are clamoring to get involved, I think that's one option for a cleaner minded data center company, that they can also just be constructed and connected faster if they go with clean energy.
Yeah, such a good point. Clean energy is not only cheaper, it's also so much faster at a time when speed really matters.
I mean, the one thing I just have to add to that, I mean, you have to understand with these data centers, it's like nothing we've ever seen. The size of some of these data centers are just absolutely enormous. And whatever they're being powered by, it requires a massive amount of energy needs to be mobilized to power one of these things. It's just a phenomenon like we've never seen in our industry before, that a single customer would draw as much power as a small city in some cases. And the deployment of any resource in a timely fashion to meet those kind of loads is really challenging, and it's really a challenge, certainly for PJM, who has no power to spare, but for the entire nation.
Yeah. So speaking of the entire nation, Ray asks, why is PJM so stymied by this while other RTOs are able to process their queues much quicker? Is there a quick answer to that?
Well, we can't really claim anything about their motivation other than what we've already said about their stakeholders and the profit motive of the people who are behind the scenes making the decisions, the profit motive. We've seen states like Texas, like, basically eliminate all, let it all connect. And there's probably some problems with that strategy too. But there's the mixture of, like, just good intention, bad culture, and changing, long traditions at my most generous description to, like, just pure profit motive. They make more money the harder it is. Somewhere in between is probably the truth.
Well, I just have to add to that, the irony of Texas is they have a massive amount of solar deployed in Texas. Many fold what PJM has, and with all that solar comes battery storage, because the battery storage economics are enhanced by having solar to back, and so Texas, ironically, is a real success story for clean and renewable energy, and a model for how it can work and power the system, where PJM has just always seemed so skeptical of clean energy as a primary resource.
Yeah. Okay, there's two more questions I really want to get to that are interesting and on angles we haven't touched yet. So Ken asks, why does PJM have the legal authority to require a data center to acquire its own energy source independent of the grid? Can it deny a data center access to the grid if it declines? Claire?
Yeah, I can jump in. I'm not a lawyer, so please take this with a grain of salt. But this is kind of an open question right now, is whether RTOs have the authority to deny these interconnection requests from the load side. I think it's something different RTOs are approaching differently, and something we think FERC will have to reckon with. I'll just say, Ken, I think an important piece of this is that we don't want data centers to become little islands necessarily that are separated from the grid. We actually think the new energy that data centers could bring online could benefit everyone in the region and reduce prices overall. So we want to make sure that as they're paying for that energy, so it's not being socialized by the general public. And if they want to come online before they have that firm service, they agree to be interruptible. So if there's an emergency, data centers are the ones who are forced to be interruptible in those times, not the regular person who's not causing the emergency to happen in the first place. So yeah, I'll just say that's an open question about, like, denying a data center necessarily, but I'm curious if John or Emily have thoughts on that too.
I think you covered that pretty well. It is something that needs to be sorted out.
Right, and so connecting that to the urgency of this moment, that is not something that PJM has sorted out yet, and it needs to be, because these issues are happening right now. So a great last question to end on. Does PJM provide any opportunities for public comments or participation, like hearings or anything like that? Unfortunately, not much, but are there any kind of ways that our voices can be heard in this conversation?
I mean, I'd argue that there's probably some. I actually try to stay away from it, thanks to having folks like Claire and John who pay more attention, of PJM has been successful in these bad decisions when they operate behind closed doors in a black box. So it's less going and attending and advocating directly to them that makes a difference. I mean, we have a lot of people doing that. It's very important work. But the thing that we need to change is this public conversation, is them being on the New York Times, the governor's writing letters, our legislators writing letters. That's the thing that is getting them scared, being in the public conversation. And so that's easier, hopefully, for most people on this call. And I would argue more impactful than all of a sudden having your activist time being spent in a work group at a regulatory agency.
Anything to add to that, anyone?
Yeah, I'll just say, PJM will often say they pride themselves and say, sure, come to our meetings, come to our committees and so forth. But these, trust me, I'm on these all day in and day out there. Some of these meetings are 8 hours long. Nobody has the amount of time and resources to actually participate in these meetings and have a voice. And then after all the work is done, it comes down to a vote of these members, which are often skewed toward the incumbent resources. So all that work and effort goes in, and then the vote ends up swinging toward traditional resources in the end anyway. So it's quite frustrating. And, I agree with Emily that, you could probably have a bigger impact sort of from the outside.
Yeah. And that brings us to what we can all do. And I think, as Emily just said, the simplest thing we can do is just talk about this, educate folks on this, make it part of the political conversation, talk to our elected leaders about it. We can call our governors about it. And then next month at CCAN's first action hour on PJM, we're going to be writing letters to the editor, the local papers all across the PJM region. Ideally, we're going to get one in all 13 states in the region to make this a conversation that's happening not just in corporate boardrooms or back rooms, but truly everywhere, and by the people, not just by the policy wonks that have time to attend 7-hour PJM hearings. And so I'm going to put that link again in the chat. Please sign up. That's November 18th at 6 p.m. will be that first action. But in the meantime, again, please keep talking about this issue, keep researching this issue. Feel free to call your governors on this issue and stay engaged with CCAN. We'll be sending out more materials on this. And tomorrow we'll send out a blast that has a copy of this recording in case you missed part of it or want to share it with your friends or family, and other resources as well. So thank you all so much for joining this webinar tonight. Again, taking 50 minutes out of your Thursday night to talk about this not often discussed, but crucial issue that affects clean energy and affects what we're all paying every month all across this region. So thank you all, and look forward to staying connected and taking more action on PJM.
Thank you,
Have
Jake.
a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.